Good afternoon. I'm Mallory Factor, the John C. West Professor of American Government and International Politics here at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is the final session of the Conservative Intellectual Tradition in America. Since this is our last lecture, I'd like to thank the organizations and people who have made this series possible. I, of course, would like to thank the Citadel, and specifically Lieutenant General John Rosa, Brigadier General Sam Hines, Brigadier General Tom Elzey, Dean Bowmoor, Colonel Gardel Furtada, Colonel Jeff Perez, Jennifer Wallace, Gervais Haggerty, and the facilities people here who have just made this really work. I'd also like to thank our videographers, Fox Commercial Media, who have been putting this together and doing such a great job. I also would like to thank the Citadel Foundation, Dennis Bergvall, Gary Hassan, and Catherine Hanhauser. And I really need to thank our partner, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, and its chairman, Alfred Regnery, its president, Chris Long, and its executive vice president, Jeff Nelson, who's here with us today. I'd also like to thank Doug Minson of the John Jay Institute, and of course, the cadets and enlisted men who took this course. You are absolutely fabulous, and I have learned as much from you as I've learned from our speakers, and I thank you for sharing this experience with me. Today's topic, the future of the conservative movement. We've looked at the roots and the development of the American conservative movement, and we've considered the movement's present. Today's discussion will look forward and ask where the conservative movement is going. Will conservatism remain a mainstream and important political philosophy in American politics? Will it grow? Will it decline? What will its fundamental characteristics be in the future? Our three speakers will come at these questions from three very different perspectives, each representing one leg of that fusionist stool that we talked about when we discussed Bill Buckley. Dr. Ralph Reed is known as a cultural conservative. Director James Woolsey is known for his national security perspective. And Senator Rand Paul, who will be joining us by video conference because of Senate voting today, is known for his Tea Party leadership and his fiscal conservative positions. But let's move on to our first speaker. With our first speaker, we have a man who actually made cultural conservatives a crucial part of the conservative movement and central to American politics, Ralph Reed. Ralph was born in Virginia, received his BA from the University of Georgia, and his PhD in history from Emory University. He's the author-editor of 5 best-selling books. He's been named one of the top 10 political newsmakers in the nation by Newsweek and one of the most influential leaders of his generation by Life magazine. Ralph served as executive director of the Christian Coalition from 1989 through 1997 and developed it into the nation's most effective grassroots political organization with over 2 million members. Ralph has recently founded and is the chairman of Faith and Freedom Coalition, the Faith and Freedom Coalition. It's a grassroots public policy organization with already 30 state chapters and 500,000 members. He's also chairman and CEO of Century Strategies, which is a public relations firm. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Ralph Eugene Reed.
Thanks a lot, Mallory. Appreciate it. Thank you, friend. Thank you very much, Mallory. Appreciate it. It's really a great honor to be here. I can't believe this, but it's my first visit to the Citadel, and it's been terrific, even in the brief time that I've been on campus. It's really a terrific honor to share the podium today with two really incredible patriots who have accomplished so much for our shared values, who I've been a big fan of for many years in the case of former CIA Director Jim Woolsey and Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, both of whom are good friends. I want to thank not only the Citadel and the Citadel Foundation and my good friend Mallory Factor, but also ISI and Chris Long and their leadership team, who I've had the privilege of working with for many years. What I'd like to do today in the time that I have is give a brief overview of the history, the current state of affairs, and what I think is likely to be the future of the religious conservative movement. I've been involved in this movement really from the time I became a deeply committed Christian in 1983. I was then the executive director of the College Republican National Committee, and our job was to cause as much difficulty for the bureaucrats who ran the Republican National Committee as we possibly could. And I was out organizing young people for Ronald Reagan. And after I came to Christ, I started to organize as many Christian young people as I could. I later started an organization called Students for America. And then in 1989, I was privileged to be selected as the first executive director of the Christian Coalition, and this was only a few months after Jerry Falwell had closed the Moral Majority, which he did at the Southern Baptist Convention meeting in Las Vegas in, I believe, June of 1989. And at that time, if you go back, if you Google it, and you really look at what all the smart people said, they said that the religious right was dead and that it was over. They could not have been more wrong. Within a few years of those statements, the Christian Coalition had over 1 million members and had over 1,000 local chapters, and we had just helped to turn out millions of evangelical voters, a net gain of 9 million votes in the 94 landslide over the 1990 baseline, leading to the election of the first Republican majority in the House and the Senate together at the same time in 40 years. And at the time, we said, quoting Mark Twain, that the premature reports of our death were greatly exaggerated. And this remains true today. And it's hard not to, or I should say, it's hard to overstate what a significant religious, cultural, and political development this is in the history of our country. Because from the time of the Scopes trial, the so-called monkey trial in 1925, when a high school teacher, John T. Scopes, was put on trial in Dayton, Tennessee, for violating Tennessee state law and teaching the theory of evolution in a public science class, from the time that he was convicted and then that conviction was overturned by an appellate court until really the mid-1970s, evangelicals lived in self-imposed political exile in their own country. They really largely withdrew from the civic debates. A self-imposed exile that stretched over 2 generations and spanned 2 world wars, one hot and the other cold. They reeled from their defeat in the debate over evolution. They smarted from the crude caricature drawn of them by critics like H.L. Mencken, who denounced them as boobs and yokels and morons, and accused them of polluting our society with what he called, and I quote, theological bilge. They were buffeted by the twin forces of modernity and ascendant liberal theology. And these evangelicals and fundamentalists, who really from their rise during the Second Great Awakening in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, on throughout the 19th century and well into the early 20th century, dominated American culture, education, and politics, engaged in a systematic and deliberate retreat from public life. The failure and ultimately the repeal of prohibition 8 years after the Scopes trial seemed to signal their final humiliating defeat and repudiation. And for the next 40 years, even though they were over 40 million strong, they really existed as a nation within a nation, a society within a society, and a people within a people, turning inward, building their own educational, cultural, and church-related institutions. And their isolation was so complete that it didn't come to an end even with the Supreme Court's decision in 1963 declaring prayer in the public schools unconstitutional in the case Engel versus Vitale, and it didn't even end with the Roe v. Wade decision. If you go back and look at when Roe v. Wade became law in 1973, you hear barely a whisper from the evangelical community. Sure, they disagreed with the decision, but they really had no grassroots or political or lobby institutions to oppose it because those had withered away in the previous 40 years. And the main opposition to Roe v. Wade and the main impulse behind an attempt to pass a constitutional amendment protecting unborn children actually came from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. What ultimately ended their political exile, ironically enough, was the election and their subsequent disappointment with one of their own, Jimmy Carter, the most explicitly evangelical president since Woodrow Wilson. Carter was a devout Southern Baptist. He was somebody who taught Sunday school every Sunday, almost without fail, at the Baptist church that he attended in Plains, Georgia. He was the first president in modern times to claim to be born again, which was a phrase that a lot of Americans were unfamiliar with. And his astonishing victory, first in the Democratic primaries, over more formidable, or at least apparently formidable foes like Scoop Jackson and Hubert Humphrey in the 1976 Democratic primaries, and then his ultimate victory over Gerald Ford, caused Newsweek to put him on its cover and declare that year, quote, the year of the evangelical. And there were a lot of evangelical leaders like back then. People like Lou Sheldon with the Traditional Values Coalition, Pat Robertson, who was then not really politically engaged, although he had a huge ministry, the Christian Broadcasting Network, who either flirted with Carter or openly supported Carter. But it didn't take long for them to be disappointed. And their disappointment reached a crescendo in 1978 when the Carter administration's Department of the Treasury proposed the promulgation of regulations that would have required Christian schools across the United States to demonstrate that they were not functioning as segregated academies seeking to sidestep court-ordered desegregation or risk losing their tax-exempt status. This was seen as such hostility towards Christian education in America under the administration of a man who said he was a born-again Christian, that evangelicals began to turn on Jimmy Carter in large numbers and desperately searched for a new political leader. They found it in the unlikely person of Ronald Reagan, a former liberal Democrat, a former union president, a former B-grade actor, the first divorced man to ever win a major party nomination. A man who, when asked if he was born again, said, "We don't use that phrase in my church." A man who very rarely attended formal church services. But make no mistake about it, Ronald Reagan was an historic figure for evangelical Christians. He was a man of deep faith in God. He was a man who believed that he had a clear mission and purpose to his life, namely the defeat and ultimately the transcendence of Soviet communism. And he held the strongly pro-life, pro-family, and traditionalist views that became the touchstone of the religious conservative movement. And when Ronald Reagan, on the Monday after winning or formally accepting the Republican nomination for president in 1980, went to the Religious Roundtable meeting in Dallas at Reunion Arena, and there were roughly 18 to 20,000 evangelicals cheering him. And after he was introduced, he went to the podium and he said, "I know that you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and the work that you're doing for a better America." And that was really the formal marriage ceremony of the evangelical pro-family religious conservative movement and the modern Republican Party under Ronald Reagan. And there have really only been two significant demographic transformations in our politics. in the last 150 years that rival this movement of evangelicals from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The first was the movement of African Americans from the party of Lincoln to the party of FDR, which took place between 1932 and 1940. Even in 1932, Herbert Hoover carried a majority of the African American vote against FDR. And as late as 1960, Richard Nixon was a card-carrying member of the NAACP and battled Jack Kennedy for the black vote. In fact, John F. Kennedy carried the state of Georgia by a larger margin than he carried his own state of Massachusetts. That's how well Democrats used to do among white voters in the South, and they didn't do as well among blacks. But as the movement of African Americans from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, from the party of the great emancipator Lincoln to the compassionate FDR, is a legacy that lives with us to this day. In the presidency of Barack Obama, Obama won 98% of the black vote in 2008. Now keep in mind, that's within the margin of error of the exit poll, which is 4%. So it's possible that John McCain didn't get any black votes. And it just tells you how big this move was. The second big change was the movement of ethnic Catholic union households into the Democratic Party. The great political scientist V.O. Key has demonstrated that this movement really began in 1928 with the nomination of the first Catholic major party nominee in U.S. history, New York Governor Al Smith, who was a wet, who opposed prohibition, and who lost in a landslide. But just as Goldwater's defeat in '64 signaled the emergence of a Republican South, so too did Al Smith's defeat in 1928, presaged the later victory of FDR and the rise of a huge Catholic union household vote. Of course, they would later be called Reagan Democrats when they began to vote for Reagan in 1980. And half of the evangelicals in the country reside south of the Mason-Dixon line. So as they began to move into the Republican Party between 1976 and 1980, they helped move the South from being a blue region to being a red region. And let me just tell you how dramatic this really was. In 1946, when the Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives in the post-World War II anti-Truman landslide, there were 105 members of the House from the 11 states of the old Confederacy. 103 of them were Democrats. Only 2 were Republicans. Fast forward to today in 2010, now with evangelicals being a reliably Republican constituency. Today there are 152 members of the House from the 11 states of the Old South, and only 47 of them are Democrats. And if you look at the Senate, there are 22 senators from those 11 states. 20 of them are Republicans, only 2 are Democrats. And we see this throughout the region. Now, for most of the Reagan and Bush years, evangelicals focused on really 3 primary issue clusters. Number 1, the passage of a constitutional amendment legalizing prayer in the public schools. Number 2, passage of a human life amendment that would have declared unborn children persons under the 14th Amendment and afforded them legal protection. And thirdly, the nomination of conservatives and strict constructionists to the federal courts, and especially the U.S. Supreme Court, where evangelicals, pro-family Catholics, and other religious conservatives felt that the Supreme Court had been openly hostile to their values. But the Human Life Amendment never had the votes to pass either the House or the Senate during the 1980s. The School Prayer Amendment passed in the House but narrowly failed in the Senate while Reagan was president in spite of bipartisan support. And attempts to move the Supreme Court in a more conservative direction were frustrated by the confirmation of Sandra Day O'Connor, who turned out to be much more moderate than they had hoped, and by the defeat of Robert Bork in 1987. And when the court upheld Roe v. Wade in the Casey v. Planned Parenthood decision in 1992, It was a symbol of the frustration of evangelicals. Now, this gets us to where I began, which is the election of Bill Clinton, the closing of moral majority, and the media and the pundits declaring the religious conservative movement dead. But they weren't dead. They just had to retool, and they had to come up with a new playbook. And part of that playbook took place with an article that I wrote for the Policy Review, which was the flagship publication of the Heritage Foundation, entitled Casting a Wider Net. And that article argued that evangelicals needed to work on a wider array of issues, not just school prayer and abortion. They needed to work on all issues, spending issues, tax issues, welfare reform, and bring their time-honored Judeo-Christian values to bear on all areas of public policy. The second innovation was incrementalism. If you weren't going to be able to move the country in the direction you wanted it to by throwing a Hail Mary pass, confirming a couple of conservative Supreme Court justices and hoping that they overturn Roe or passing a constitutional amendment. And what religious conservatives learned is what everybody before them learned. The feminists learned it when they failed to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. It's hard to amend the Constitution. The founders made it that way. So like hamsters trying to get to a food pellet, they just tried to go a different way. And the National Right to Life Committee, using model legislation that had already passed in the state of Ohio, put forward a federal ban on a procedure known as partial birth abortion, a very rare and gruesome procedure in which a child is partially delivered and then, in effect, systematically executed. Now, we worked with the National Right to Life Committee to pass that ban 3 different times before it was finally signed into law by George W. Bush. Bill Clinton vetoed it twice. The Christian Coalition, working with Congressman Frank Wolf of Virginia and Tim Hutchinson of Arkansas, made its #1 legislative priority: the passage of a $500 per child tax credit, on the argument that big government was constituting a crushing tax burden on middle-class families with children. We argued that the most successful Department of Health, Education, and Welfare ever conceived was the intact 2-parent family. Why, therefore, were we taking 40% of their income? Why not allow more of their money to stay in their pockets and in their homes so that they could use it as they saw fit for the education and the nurture and the health care of their children? This $500 per child tax credit became part of Republican orthodoxy. It was included in the Republican budget alternative in 1993 under then-ranking Republican Budget Committee member John Kasich, and it was included in the contract with America. It ultimately became law when Bill Clinton reluctantly signed it into law in 1996, and George W. Bush doubled the $500 per child tax credit to $1,000 in 2001. And by the way, you will note that even as Barack Obama and the Democrats today say they want to repeal the Bush tax cuts or allow them to expire, they always say they want to keep the $1,000 per child tax credit and they want to keep the amelioration of the marriage penalty, which was another thing that we proposed and ultimately became law on a bipartisan basis. Similarly, we and other pro-family groups lobbied for welfare reform, arguing that welfare, instead of being something that was delivering people from poverty, was instead institutionalizing it. And it was consigning millions of Americans, especially racial minorities, to the misery of the underclass by subsidizing family breakup and out-of-wedlock births, which we know statistically consign people to poverty. In fact, Rick Santorum recently on the campaign trail, before he got out of the presidential race, was often fond of citing a 2009 Brookings Institute study that found that if you didn't graduate from high school, didn't have a full-time job, and bore children repeatedly out of wedlock, you had a 76% chance of being in poverty. But if you got a high school diploma, got a job and kept it, any job, no matter how low paying, if you got married and stayed married, and you had children within the institution of marriage, 2% chance of being in poverty. So during the 1990s, working with Republicans like Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey, we helped move 2 million Americans from welfare to work, from government dependency to dignity and self-reliance. And this really presages or predicts the future of the religious conservative movement. It's more effective than it's ever been. It's more sophisticated than it's ever been. And if you look at the Tea Party movement, which flowered in 2009, the Tea Party movement is steadfastly focused on fiscal and spending issues. But according to studies conducted by both the Pew Research Organization and the Public Religion Research Institute, 70% of all Tea Party members are self-identified evangelical Christians. And 3/4 of Tea Party members and supporters are social conservatives. They're pro-life, they're pro-marriage, and they're for religious freedom and liberty. And there's remarkable overlap between social conservative voters and Tea Party voters. In the 2010 elections, according to a post-election survey conducted by Public Opinion Strategies, fully 41% of all voters who went to the polls in 2010 self-identified as Tea Party members. And 31% of all voters identified themselves as born-again evangelicals or conservative Christians. So again, you see that 70% overlap between the two constituencies. If you've attended a Tea Party rally or been at a Tea Party event, you know that there is a decided religious and spiritual flavor to their rallies and events. The Tea Party anthem is a song called I Am America, in which the singer Krista Branch sings, "I've got some good news. We're taking names, and we're waiting now for Judgment Day." I don't know how uplifting a message that is. But on the music video, there's a girl holding up a sign that says 2 Chronicles 7:14. This is a verse from the Old Testament that has tremendous significance and meaning in the evangelical community because it speaks to the need for both personal as well as national repentance and humility. And when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office as president on January 20th, 1981, he put his hand on a Bible that had belonged to his mother, and the Bible was open to 2 Chronicles 7:14. Now, this is not to suggest that the Tea Party movement and the religious conservative movement are the same, nor is it to suggest that they're synonymous. But what it does demonstrate is that evangelicals, who are often caricatured as caring only about so-called cultural issues like school prayer, marriage, and abortion, actually are now engaged in a much wider number of issues, and they have never been more effective, and they have never turned out in larger numbers to the polls. The final change, and I'll close with this, is, and this is significant, the religious conservative movement has gone from a largely church-based movement led by pastors and religious leaders to being a grassroots movement, a precinct-based movement led largely by political operatives and by political leaders and elected officials. When Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority in 1979, he would usually hold I Love America rallies in churches. And most Moral Majority state organizations were headed by an independent Baptist or Southern Baptist pastor. Now, this was natural and logical at the time because the church served as an incubator of the movement. But today, the president of the Family Research Council is Tony Perkins, who's a former very effective state legislator from the state of Louisiana. President of the Susan B. Anthony List is Marjorie Dannenfelser, who's a former Capitol Hill staffer and public policy activist. And the head of my organization, Faith and Freedom Coalition, Gary Marks, has been a political consultant, has worked on numerous state and federal campaigns, and served as the senior campaign aide in the Bush-Cheney re-election. As a result of this, the pro-family and religious conservative movement has moved from being a movement on the margins of our political system, with their noses pressed against the glass of the culture, to a mainstream movement fully integrated with the most advanced and sophisticated voter registration and get-out-the-vote technology available. At Faith and Freedom Coalition, for example, we've built, in just 3 short years, a database marrying consumer databases with voter lists of 31 million social conservative voters who can be reached by snail mail, by email, by social networking technology like Twitter and Facebook, and by text message. We have never been able to identify and deploy, both in lobbying issues and in going to the polls, a larger number of social conservative voters. And I predict that with this current administration, it's out of the mainstream federal court appointments, its statement in federal court that the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional, and its Obamacare mandate requiring churches and religious charities and educational institutions to cover and subsidize health care services which violate their conscience is only going to make 2012 the biggest turnout of these voters in U.S. history. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to questions and answers.
Our next speaker has had an illustrious career in national security and intelligence. R. James Woolsey grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, earned his B.A. from Stanford University, was a Rhodes Scholar, and received his law degree from the Yale Law School. He practiced law for 22 years in the fields of civil litigation, arbitration, and mediation. Director Woolsey has served 4 presidents, each time working tirelessly and with distinction to make our nation secure and to keep us safe from threats from abroad. He's known for being a Democrat that is hawkish in national defense, but has held important positions in both Democratic and Republican administrations. Some of his government assignments have included serving as a delegate on the U.S.-Soviet Strategic Arms Reduction talks, START, serving as Undersecretary of the Navy, serving as ambassador to the negotiations on conventional armed forces in Europe, CFE, and then, from 1993 to 1995, he served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency during President Clinton's first administration. Since his term as CIA director, Mr. Woolsey has been involved in many notable ventures, including advising private equity firms, serving as chairman of Woolsey Partners, LLC. He also serves on the National Commission on Energy, among many other commissions and boards, and believes that energy policy is critical to our current and future national security and is the rallying cry for uniting the conservative movement. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce the Honorable Robert James Woolsey, Jr.
Mallory, thank you. And it's a real honor to be asked to be here today with you and to be on the same panel as Ralph, whom I've admired for many years, and also to have Senator Paul in attendance virtually. I am quite honored, but to tell you the truth, since I spent 22 years as a Washington lawyer, and then I spent some time out at the CIA in the Clinton administration, I'm actually honored to be invited into any polite company for any purpose at all. I often, almost always, get a question in the Q&A period of speeches that I figure I may as well go ahead and answer now because it always comes up. People say, you know, you were only out there at the CIA for a couple of years or so. You weren't a career guy. Did you ever participate in any of those, you know, covert operations? And the answer is, yeah, I did once. And this is a small and discreet group. I think I can probably share it with you. It occurred because my wife and I were in the same class at Stanford, and so our college reunion came up at the same time in the fall of '93. I'd been out at the CIA for about 8 months. She'd been the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, so we both had 24/7 jobs, and we decided we'd take off some time, 3 or 4 days, go see the homecoming game, see a lot of old friends, fly to California, cash in the old frequent flyer miles. Well, the first thing that happened was my director of security at the CIA, came to me and said, Mr. Director, I'm afraid Mrs. Woolsey's going to have to go on a different flight. We just can't have anybody named Woolsey on the flight. And I said, but my name's Woolsey. And he said, oh, no, sir, you're going to need to fly an alias. And, of course, my first thought was, uh-oh, there go the frequent flyer miles. So my wife and I go out to Dulles Airport with our 2 security men, and we put her on her frequent flyer flight, United to San Francisco, and sitting in a nice first-class seat, sipping a glass of Chardonnay. She takes off. The 2 security men and I go down to another United flight. As we get on, in those rather simpler times, they stopped by the cockpit, showed the captain and the chief flight attendant that they were carrying weapons, showed cards that they were authorized to do so by the federal government, and we go back to the back row of coach, where the 3 seats right in front of that barrier in front of the Johns where you can't even lean back. So I'm wedged in between these 2 big guys for, 6 hours flight to San Francisco. We get off and we're walking down the jetway, and the flight attendant comes over and whispers something to one of my 2 security men, whose nickname was Rock for about 4 reasons. And I had not seen Rock even smile in the 8 months he'd been on my security detail. And when the flight attendant whispered to him, he just cracked up. So naturally, I was curious. I said, hey, Rock, what's so funny? He said, you know what she said? She said, I've been on these flights now for 20 years, and that's the politest and best behaved prisoner we have ever had on one of these. So, mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. Got to California undercover. Not a problem. Well, let me say a few words about 3 aspects of national security. First of all, you can kind of color me neocon, close enough for government work. I was founder and president of Yale Citizens for Eugene McCarthy for president in 1967-68. I headed up the anti-war campaign at Yale in those years. And we were, by the way, the most conservative organized political group on the Yale campus. Everybody else was burning something. They were burning bras or burning draft cards or burning something. So, but we organized a lot of it, the campaign in New Hampshire, and had a little bit of an impact on what happened in American politics as a result. In the 70s, I ended up working as general counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee for a marvelous man. The late Senator John Stennis of Mississippi was chairman, and the number 2 ranking Democrat was Scoop Jackson. And Frank Gaffney, Richard Pearl, and I all worked together for these marvelous men. And part of what was going on there, and went on for some years before and after, was within the Democratic Party holding the Republicans up to a high standard with respect to protecting the country. For example, we had a good deal, Scoop did, a good deal to do with, of course, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was a way, by barring the extension of most favored nation treatment to the Soviet Union until they liberalized the release of Jews to emigrate, we had something to do with countering some of the more accommodating aspects of détente, for example. That part of the Democratic Party is almost all gone. I wouldn't say all, but a great deal of it is gone. And that history, I would say, of working hard on making the United States sound militarily and having more defense capability than that which is barely enough, and standing up to dictators when they need to be stood up to, and accepting America's leadership role among the democracies of the world. That set of views is something that I think it is extremely important for conservatives, small c, large c, evangelical, paleo, neo, whatever, to espouse, and not to slip into the stance that some did, for example, in the 1930s in the America First movement, which was responsible for a more isolationist point of view and which made it far more difficult for Roosevelt to stand up to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan before Pearl Harbor. So let me say a word about three threats to national security. And I'll be brief because it's fine to raise these in the Q&A period. First of all, this country needs well-trained, substantial military forces in order to be able to deter those who would exercise power against the weak. And right now I'm thinking particularly about Iran in the Middle East, and I'm thinking about China with respect to East Asia. There is no doubt that the Chinese, without our being part of the picture, would be exerting control over major parts of coastal Asia, major countries in Asia, and would do so rather quickly and thoroughly. There is no doubt that without the United States taking some decisive stances at least, and hopefully actions as well, Iran will survive its current difficulties, and Iran will before too long have a nuclear weapon. And a nuclear weapon in Iran means that since Shiite Iran will have a weapon, it means that Sunni Egypt, Sunni Saudi Arabia, and Sunni Turkey will have nuclear weapons before long. Because once you have a nuclear reactor for creating electricity, you can get into the fuel cycle, as it's called, the enrichment of uranium and the reprocessing of plutonium, and thereby move toward having a nuclear weapon the way the Pakistanis have, the way the North Koreans have, and the way the Iranians will, unless we do something. The problem here is that whereas we survived 45 years of a Cold War with both us and the Soviets having nuclear weapons, and only one time really came close to a nuclear exchange during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did have essentially an effective deterrence and containment and nuclear standoff with the Soviets, and since their lousy economy could not keep them going, after some 45 years, it effectively collapsed. And we won the Third World War, in a sense, the Cold War, without having fired a shot vis-a-vis the United States and the Soviet Union. Certainly we had Vietnam, and certainly we had Korea. But we won without any kind of a military exchange, much less a nuclear exchange with the Soviets. It would be wonderful if we could deal with the rest of our problems in the world as effectively as we did against the Soviets. But by the early mid-1960s, I would say, the Soviet ideology was dead. There were true committed Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries back in the 20s and 30s and 40s in the United States. But I'd say that probably by the 1960s, there were more true committed revolutionaries in the bookstores of the Upper West Side of Manhattan than there were in the Kremlin. I negotiated with those guys 4 times, and they didn't want to die for the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They wanted to remodel their dachas, their summer homes. We outlasted them because they had an empty set of values and an empty economy. Would that we could do the same as time rolls on. But as I'll get to in a moment, we have a rather different set of problems now and a different type of enemy. All of that takes a substantial military establishment. One needs to have the world know that we can stand up to whomever would come against us and deal with them effectively. We have to have more than that, which is barely enough. There is room for reasonable disagreement as to whether we need 11 aircraft carriers or 10 or 12. But there is, I think, not room for reasonable disagreement about the need to be able to protect the country in very substantial measure with military forces not much smaller than what we have now. And the sequestration that has been tentatively agreed upon for the end of the year would, in my judgment, and far more importantly, in the judgment of the Secretary of Defense, be a disaster for the Department of Defense and the country's ability to manage its foreign affairs and its relations with the rest of the world. The second and third areas of security that I think it's particularly important for us to focus on both relate to energy. And whereas unless we fritter it away, we will be able to deal effectively with most conventional military enemies, as we did Iraq and as we did Bosnia and Serbia in the actions in the Clinton administration against them coming into Bosnia and coming into Kosovo. Energy is different. First of all, we have two basic large energy systems in the United States: electricity and transportation. Electricity is supplied for us by natural gas, coal, nuclear power, hydropower, and some renewables. Essentially all of it domestic. We don't have a foreign supply problem with respect to electricity. We have a serious problem with respect to our electricity grid, a security problem, which I'll mention in a moment. But in terms of foreign supply, it's just not there. One of the most deceptive things that is said in the current political campaign is that we have a problem because we have foreign supply of our oil, therefore we need to build more solar, more wind turbines, etc. Build more solar and wind turbines if you want. They're clean ways to generate electricity. They have advantages and disadvantages, but they don't have anything to do with our oil dependence. In the early 1970s, we made over 20% of our electricity from burning oil. So then, back at the time of the Yom Kippur War in the early 70s, if you built a wind farm or a nuclear power plant, you were in fact reducing the country's demand for foreign oil. Today, less than 1% of our electricity comes from burning oil, most of it in Hawaii. Today, if you say, as the administration does perpetually, that you are helping solve our oil dependence, foreign oil dependence problem by building solar or wind or really anything else to produce electricity, you are in fact dealing with less than 1% of the problem. That is something of a record in modern political rhetoric. Most political rhetoric is either 60-40 right or wrong, or 70-30, or 80-20, or 90-10. Very few political statements consistently made are 99+% wrong, as this one is. Well, the problem with the electric grid is not that we have foreign supply issues. The problem with the electric grid is that it is, although extraordinarily capable and a wonder of its time in a way, it is extraordinarily fragile in some key ways. First of all, when we went through the Y2K issue back 12, 13 years ago, the internet was just coming into very heavy use. And the people who were fixing our grid and all of our other operations of computers and everything else in the country so they wouldn't crash when the calendar turned to 2000, decided that as long as they were changing things, maybe what they'd do would be to create a situation whereby they would put the control systems for the electric grid on the internet. And that way it was cheap, it was easy, the internet was getting upgraded. Why not? What a good idea. Well, there's a problem. The problem is hacking. The problem is cyber excellence on the part of the Chinese and the Russians. The problem is that if you are modernizing the web and the electric grid in such a way that you have a, quote, smart grid, and you can turn down your air conditioning at your home from your cell phone, you may be making it possible for a teenager in Shanghai to turn down your air conditioning from his cell phone, or more, or something worse than just turning your air conditioning in a way you don't want it turned. So the fact that the SCADA systems, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems of the electric grid, operate in many cases, not all, but in many cases over the web, has created a remarkable set of vulnerabilities to terrorists, to those who are merely seeking to cause mischief, to those who would steal money from the utilities. A great deal hangs on our ability to do something relatively quickly to make it possible for us to manage our electric grid other than the way it's being managed now. Now, why is this important? The United States has 18 critical infrastructure systems, water, sewage, food delivery, etc. All 17 of the others depend on electricity. If the electric grid goes down for a few days, as it did in the northeastern part of the United States and eastern Canada back in 2003, we can pretty much all deal with it. You got usually a few gallons of fuel for a generator, or you go stay with somebody who was more far-sighted than you were and has a few gallons of fuel for a generator. It usually works itself out. But intentional interference could take the grid down for much longer than that. Many days, to weeks, to months. So we have, in the first place, a very serious problem in that if the grid goes down, pretty soon these other systems go down too. And we are not back in the 1970s pre-internet. We are back in the 1870s pre-electricity, and I doubt if any of us has enough plow horses or water pump handles to deal with the situation. So chalk that off as one very serious problem connected with our electricity grid. There's another. The transformers that we have, which step up voltage so you can have very long distance sending of electricity and then step down the voltage so it can be sent to your home and used, those transformers are very hard to find. They're absolutely vital to the system. They cost a great deal. They're extremely heavy, very difficult to move. There are two places where they're built, South Korea and Northern Europe, Northern Germany last time I looked. And you need to go stand in line to have them built because they are designed in such a way they fit into a specific slot for a specific transformer. They're not generic, not modular. The utilities think they're doing a good job of providing resilience because on those rare occasions when they have a spare transformer, oh, by the way, these sit behind cyclone fences, 100, 200 feet off and away from the highway. And if you want to know what the transformer is and what you would shoot with, say, a .45 pistol in order to take it out, it's the things that the signs point to that say, danger, do not touch. So we hope, in case a terrorist only speaks 3 or 4 words of English, like danger, do not touch, he's in business. So the danger and the risk of not having a way in which we can protect our electric grid from either individuals or from terrorist groups subordinate to rogue countries or countries' personnel themselves is a very serious problem. The third problem is electromagnetic pulse. A nuclear detonation sends a series of pulses, and without getting into the technical details, even a simple nuclear weapon, if detonated, say, a couple of 100 kilometers up, can send out an electromagnetic pulse that, based on a recent major congressional study, would seem to be able to take down huge sections of the electric grid. Now, don't we have ballistic missile defense? Couldn't we stop something like that? Well, it does not have to be an intercontinental ballistic missile from someplace like China. It could be a small Scud missile, of which some 40 countries have them, based on a fishing boat out of Iran. All you have to do is launch it, and as you detonate it as it's going up. We have no ballistic missile defense that deals with anything in the ascent phase. It's only when it's mid-course or coming down terminal. So if Iran, or somebody Iran is working with, decides they would like to disable a huge share of the American electric grid, that is, I'm afraid, open to them. And the changes that have recently been made in our ballistic missile defense in order to accommodate the Russians go the wrong way rather than a helpful way in terms of dealing with a problem like this. Well, these three aspects of vulnerability of our infrastructure, there are others, but these three rather salient ones suggest to me that it is extremely important as we focus on the future. Conservatives, in order to be able to deal with and have the confidence of the population that they'll be able to deal with the worst of what might be presented to the United States, need to learn about these issues and take them seriously and not brush them off, because we are unfortunately far easier to reach by, say, Iranian fishing boats than anything anybody remotely had in mind, even in recent decades, and certainly in the decades back, say, before Pearl Harbor. Now, there's a second aspect of energy that is also a huge problem, and I'll close with this. We borrow about $1 billion a day in order to import oil. Even when we pump more, that just means the price still stays up because the supply doesn't take it down, because OPEC reduces what they're pumping in order to keep the price up around $100 a barrel. OPEC controls 80% of the world's reserves of conventional petroleum. We control 2%. OPEC lifts oil for $5 to $10 a barrel throughout the organization. In the Middle East, the 8 states of the Middle East, it lifts oil for about $5 a barrel. When you lift oil for $5 a barrel and sell it for $105, as they do, you're doing reasonably well. It doesn't matter that we buy most of our foreign oil from Canada. There's one worldwide market. If we buy more from Canada and less from Saudi Arabia, somebody else buys more from Saudi Arabia and less from Canada. It's a pool. It's a giant pool. There are temporary offsets, such as needing the right kind of refinery for the right degree of sulfur in the oil or whatever, but they're not the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is that we don't solve the problem either by buying oil from countries that are nearer to us, like Canada, or even buying it from ourselves. Buying it from ourselves is a good idea. Drilling for more oil in order to produce more helps with our balance of payments. Instead of borrowing $1 billion a day, if we get really successful, we might borrow only $900 million a day. Or really, really successful, borrow only $800 million a day. But OPEC is still in the driver's seat. So drill, baby, drill is positive, but it certainly doesn't solve the problem. The same thing is true of getting more oil production from a country that's either near us or friendly. As I said, it doesn't make that much difference. The same thing is true of improving our mileage of our cars. You improve it to a new standard, 50 miles per gallon instead of 30 miles per gallon. Good, that helps. That's a one-time drop in demand. And what happens is that OPEC simply pulls its supply down in order to keep the price up. OPEC pumps 30 million barrels of oil a day. On the eve of the Yom Kippur War in '73, when all this current situation began, OPEC pumped about 30 million barrels a day. It's about a third of what the world needs for oil. In between those years, '73 and today, it has pumped less in order to try to keep the price up. Sometimes it's been successful, sometimes not. But if you own 80% of something in the world and you only sell a third of what the world consumes every year, and if you pumped 30 million barrels a day back in the early 1970s, and now, 40 years later, when the world's economy has doubled and petroleum use has basically doubled, you still are only pumping 30 million barrels a day. There is only one term that fits you, and that is that you are a conspiracy in restraint of trade, otherwise known as a cartel. That situation means that as long as we stay enslaved to oil, we will stay in a very real way in a situation where we are operating at the behest of OPEC. And I cannot think of a more substantial challenge to our national security than that. OPEC is 12 countries, 2 in Latin America, 2 in sub-Saharan Africa, 8 in the Middle East. And Iran, Saudi Arabia, and many of the other members of OPEC do not have our best interests at heart. What can we do about some of this? Well, with respect to the electricity grid, someone needs to be in charge. It's not clear who's in charge today of security for the grid. I know that sounds strange, but there are 50 institutions that run the electricity grid in the United States and the 50 states, the Public Utility Commissions. The Department of Energy doesn't run the grid. It has a small office of 3 or 4 people that kind of watch things. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, doesn't run the grid. It sets rates for transmission over long distances. The institution that it comes closest, I suppose, is something called NERC, for the National North American Electrical Reliability Council. It's really the trade association of 3,500 utilities. And it does, if you'll pardon my bluntness and directness, zip. So if you want something done with respect to security on the electric grid, we have to find a way to put someone in charge. We need to find a way to do it consistent with our history and the local focus of electricity and the need for us to take account of consumers' needs and the rest. But one of the great, probably the largest change that came about when our Constitution was drafted was Madison and his colleagues were using as a model in many ways the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic had one tragic flaw, which was a lack of clarity about who was going to control the military. And that's what brought it effectively to its end. In our Constitution, we've got that straight. President, Commander-in-Chief, Congress has the power of the purse. But the problem is that under the current situation, we are coming close to being nearly at war with terrorists and Iranian hackers and the rest, and instead of a clear commander-in-chief, the way our Constitution sets it up, we've got a trade association of 3,500 utilities, sort of, kind of, a little bit responsible, sort of, for the security of the grid and kind of occasionally talking about maybe doing something. with respect to oil, if we want to get out from under the thumb of OPEC, we have to break oil's monopoly over transportation, and we have to break OPEC's cartel. I'm afraid there is no other way to do it. And we won't do it by any of the remedies that have been talked about much so far. We have to make it possible for American consumers to do something different than what they do now. Today, they drive in their cars. We are not addicted to oil, but our cars are. You can't put anything in there except oil products. That's what you have to drive on. And so if it goes up because OPEC wants it to go up, it goes up. If we can come up with a way to do something as sound as what, believe it or not, the Brazilians have done, which is to make it possible to drive into a filling station and choose between fuels. For them, it's gasoline and ethanol because ethanol is very cheap for them to produce on sugarcane. Then when gasoline goes very high, they just buy more ethanol and they're in control. Brazilian consumer. We are not. We're way behind the Brazilians in our ability to control our own market for fuel. If we take advantage of the fact that natural gas now, as a result of hydrofracturing, is approximately 1/10 the cost per unit of energy of oil, using natural gas, including mainly domestic American natural gas, in ways that it hasn't been used before, because when gas and oil cost about the same per unit of energy, it didn't make much sense to change from oil to natural gas. But natural gas can be used to produce fluids to drive on. Either you can make it compressed natural gas for large vehicles, trucks and buses, or you can turn it into methanol, that's with an M, wood alcohol, made from natural gas. Or some companies are starting to experiment with turning natural gas into gasoline. The point is to move away from the petroleum feedstock for the fuel that you drive on. If you can do that, and I think the technology is possible, then before too many years are up, we may be able to appear to the world as smart and clever as the Brazilians. That would be good. Let me close with just one thought. My sometime writing colleague Annie Coren came up with a wonderful illustration of what we need to do a few years ago, and she and her colleague at her think tank have written a book called Turning Oil into Salt. Salt, for thousands of years, was a strategic commodity. It was the only way to preserve food until the mid-19th century when canning came in, and even after that it was the only way to preserve meat. So salt was a very big deal. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. The word salary comes from salt. If you had a salt mine and your neighboring country did not, you were in the driver's seat. Countries were going to war over salt mines in Latin America up until the 1890s. But in the 1890s, something happened, a technological change. The electric grids started to come into operation in major cities in the world. And right away, people realized you could use electricity for little things called refrigerators and freezers. And they also realized that meat that had been frozen and thawed was not only cheaper than soaking it in an expensive salt brine, priced by a monopoly. It was not only cheaper, but the meat tasted a lot better. So it was better and cheaper to freeze meat than to soak it in salt brine. Within a very few years, essentially, salt was destroyed as a strategic commodity. It wasn't destroyed, period. We still use it on sidewalks in February, on corn on the cob. Salt has its uses. But when you went into lunch today, I doubt if any of you looked at the salt shaker on the table and said, I wonder where that comes from. I wonder if we're salt independent. No, salt's boring. Unless you're invested in Morton's, salt is boring. I would suggest that what we need to do is just to make oil boring. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is a visionary who brought fiscal conservative principles to the forefront of the debate in the Congress and across our nation. Senator Rand Paul was born in Pennsylvania and raised in Texas. He attended Baylor University and graduated from Duke Medical School. Senator Paul then practiced ophthalmology in Kentucky for 15 years before taking on the Republican Party establishment to get elected to the United States Senate in 2010. In the Senate, Senator Paul has stood for fiscal responsibility and constitutional conservatism, hearkening back to the Founding Fathers and to the Republican Party of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. Senator Paul's very first legislative proposal in the Senate was to cut $500 billion from federal spending in just 1 year. And he's promoted many innovative ideas to restrain government spending and shrink government. As a stalwart fiscal conservative, Senator Paul has been praised and supported by the Tea Party movement. He formed the Senate Tea Party caucus with Senators Jim DeMint and Mike Lee, and he wrote a book on the inspirations of the Tea Party movement and its future. His best-selling book, The Tea Party Goes to Washington. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Senator Randall Howard Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, Mallory, and thanks for inviting me. Now, when I agreed to this, Mallory, you told me I was going to get to come in 3 dimensions, just like Tupac. And what's the deal? Did the Citadel run out of money?
No, we just find you overly impressive in 1 dimension with 3 dimensions.
All
I don't know if we
right,
can handle
all
it.
right. Next time I want to appear in 3D hologram, though. That's my demand. No honorarium, but I want to be in hologram next time. You know, to know what it means to be a conservative or a moderate or liberal, I think it's important to know about the little girl. She wanted $100, and she said she'd do good things with $100, so she wrote a note. She said, "Dear God, please send me $100. So the postmaster gets the letter, and he doesn't know what to do with it, and so he sends it to the White House. The president gets the letter and says, "Oh, that's cute. The little girl wants $100. Send her $5. She'll be happy with that." So the little girl gets the $5, and her parents always told her to write a thank you, and so she starts out her letter. She says, "Dear God, thanks for the $5. But next time, don't send it through Washington. They stole 95% of it." So if you're a conservative, you don't want to send it to Washington at all. If you're a moderate, you say, well, instead of $5, if they could only return $10, everything would be okay. And if you're a liberal, you think the rich just aren't paying enough. They got to pay their fair share. Send it all in. The joke is with the tax return for a liberal is you write your income down, multiply by 100%, send it in, and maybe they'll be satisfied. But seriously, it is about a philosophy. The philosophy, to my mind and to a lot of conservatives, really the movement starts with Barry Goldwater. When I first decided to run for office, I decided to reread The Conscience of a Conservative. And it was actually published for the first time when it was published in early 60s. It was published from a publisher in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, which is near Louisville. And there's a quote towards the beginning of the book that I really like. And in that, he says, "I have little interest in streamlining government or making it more efficient, for I mean to reduce its size. I do not propose to promote welfare, but I propose to extend freedom. My aim is not to pass new bills, but to cancel out old ones. I don't intend to inaugurate new programs, but to cancel out programs that do violence to the Constitution. I will not attempt to find out whether legislation is needed before I determine whether it is constitutional. And if my constituents complain and say that I am neglecting their interest, I will inform them that I was told that their chief interest was liberty. And in that cause, I am doing the best that I can." I love that quote, and it encapsulates a lot about what I think conservatism is or should be. And that is that it's not just about making government more efficient. It's about debating and deciding what is constitutional, what is the appropriate size and scope of government. from reading The Conscience of the Conservative again, I also came across the one court case that Barry Goldwater mentions in the book. This court case is Wickard v. Filburn. And I often joke, in fact, I spoke to a Federalist Society recently, I joked with them that I think I was the only one that ran for Senate running on overturning Wickard v. Filburn. But I'm sitting in Senator Mike Lee's office, and I'm afraid to say I'm the only one because I think he would join me in saying that would be both of our goals, that we should overturn Wickard. Now, what is Wickard? Is it just an obscure Supreme Court case? No, it was the beginning of big government really in our country. It was in the 1940s, and they told a farmer who wanted to grow 20 acres of grain, they said, you can only grow 14 acres of grain. And he said, why? It's my land. I'll do what I want. And they knew this was going to be a big battle, and he said, I'm going to grow the 14 acres you let me grow, and I'm going to grow 6 acres more, and I'm not going to sell it to anybody. I'm going to be inactive with it. I'm going to feed it to my cows, and how are you going to get me on interstate commerce? Well, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and what I think is a ludicrous and wrong-headed decision. The Supreme Court says, by your inactivity, by your restraint, by not engaging in commerce, you could have indirectly affected the price of grain. And this to me was really opening Pandora's box. We went from a limited constitutional republic to a democratic government, basically with a majority rules, and the Commerce Clause can mean anything. I jokingly tell people, if my shoes were made in Tennessee, they can regulate my walking in Kentucky. The expansive notion of the Commerce Clause, all of big government began to be driven through this Commerce Clause. So for the next 50, 60 years, not one congressional law was struck down as being unconstitutional. We went 60 years with no laws being struck down. And why do I bring up Wickard? Because now Wickard has become Obamacare. Obamacare, the court case, really isn't about health care. It's about the Commerce Clause, and it's once again, to me, identical. It's the idea, the inactivity, the idea of me not participating in commerce, the idea of me not choosing to buy health insurance. How can that be commerce? I love George Will's comment on this. George Will's comment on it is that the case about Obamacare is the last exit on the road to unlimited government. Are there limitations? Does the Constitution limit the size and scope of government? Now, some would say, well, the government says we can take care of the general welfare, and so that just means we do what we want. If we get 51% of the votes, that works. But it really isn't what our founders intended. When Franklin walks out of the Constitutional Convention, they ask him, what type of government did you give us? Is it a monarchy? Is it a democracy? Is it a republic? They knew the difference between a democracy and a republic. And Franklin responds, it's a republic if you can keep it. And it is a generational, a transgenerational fight in a war to see if we can keep a republic. It's been slipping away. And now while some of the Tea Party want to say it's all President Obama's fault, he can have lots of the blame, but Republicans deserve blame also. And this is a bipartisan problem where we've slipped away and let government do more and more things. So when people say, well, what about the General Welfare Clause? Well, Madison's response was, the General Welfare Clause is true. Laws should obey and support general welfare. They shouldn't be for the specific special interest or the specific special welfare of one company or one individual. They should be for the general welfare. But when he was asked, does this mean government can do anything? He said, no. Government is still bound by only being able to do what was enumerated. You have enumerated powers that were given. There's about 18 powers given to the federal government and nothing else. Primary among that is national defense. It's really what the government should be doing and almost nothing else. But we've accumulated so many other duties up here that we've basically bankrupted our country. How serious is it? We're borrowing $50,000 a second. So we really are in the midst of a debt crisis. When people moan about the gas prices going up, I tell them, you have to understand why the gas prices are going up. Gas is not more precious. The value of your dollar is shrinking. As the value of your dollar shrinks, prices rise. But the reason this is all occurring is because of the massive debt. The way we're financing this debt is through borrowing, taxation, but also through printing new money. And as you print the new money, you devalue the existing currency. That's why prices are rising. We're tolerating it now, but what I fear is an ultimate destruction of the currency, where this gets out of hand. And in some ways, it's been out of hand since 2008. If you look on the curves of how much money is being produced and the rise in the actual production or the inflation of the currency, it's been dramatic. Now, much of that inflation has gone overseas, and we haven't seen a rise in prices that dramatic yet, but I think it's in store for us, and I worry about it. We borrow 40% of every dollar spent up here. So really, just about all of the money that comes in is spent on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest, meaning that everything else we do up here is borrowed. It's getting worse. We're on a course for disaster. We're one of 6 countries now that our debt equals our whole economy. So we have a $15 trillion debt and a $15 trillion economy. We're at a breaking point. We're at a tipping point. And to my mind, what I tell people over and over again, this isn't just Republican versus Democrat. There are many Republicans up here who have not come to the realization of where we stand and are not willing to stand up. Now, 47 Republicans in the Senate stood up and said they were for a balanced budget amendment. That's great. But there's only a few of them who actually will come forward and support a balanced budget. I've proposed a budget that balances in 5 years. The reason I chose 5 years, that's what the balanced budget amendment says. It says we'll balance it in 5 years. To do it, you have to reform entitlements. Now, people say, well, gosh, we've polled the Tea Party, and the Tea Party won't even cut Medicare. I don't think it's about cutting Medicare or cutting Social Security. It's about saving Medicare and saving Social Security by reforming them. You do have to have changes, though. You have to allow the age of eligibility to gradually rise. But if you start doing it now, it's a month or two a year, maybe 2 or 3 months a year, but it's very gradual and slow. You have to means test the benefits. This means changing our notion of what Social Security and Medicare are. But I think it is something that the public will accept. You have to get started on these things. The good news, bad news scenario I tell people is, the bad news is we're in the midst of a crisis. Admiral Mullen has said it's the number one threat to our national security is our debt, and I fully believe that. The good news, though, is that we live in really the greatest country, greatest civilization ever. And I don't say that in a very jingoistic way that somehow we're special because of the color of our skin or where we came from or somehow America's better than other countries. We are exceptional because of a set of ideas that we embrace. We are only exceptional as long as we embrace those ideas. But out of those ideas was created a tremendous amount of wealth. 50,000 people a day still are going to Disney World, for goodness sakes, in the midst of this recession. There's an incredible amount of wealth in this country. But it doesn't just mean, oh, hey, I've got more money than the next guy or more money than the next country. When you see tragedies around the world, when you see that earthquake that happened in Haiti a few years ago, who is expressing their concern and giving money to help them? It's the United States. When former Director Woolsey talked about us winning the Cold War, he was exactly right. And I put it maybe a little bit differently, but I don't think he would disagree. The engine of capitalism defeated the engine of socialism. That's why we won the Cold War. We had to have a strong national defense, but we still won because our economic engine beat socialism. It's always going to be that way, but we need to be proud of capitalism, proud of profit. I frankly get on the floor when they talk about punishing oil companies. I say I want oil companies to have more profits. I want them to have lower taxes. The oil companies employ 9.2 million people. They already pay $86 million a day in taxes. I like rich people. I don't hate people who succeed. If you're richer than me, good. If you worked hard and you came about it honestly. Now, the one area where the Tea Party, though, somewhat sympathizes with some of those from the Occupy Wall Street movement is, if you didn't come by about it honestly, if you ran your company into the ground, if your company's bankrupt, you don't deserve a bailout and you don't deserve to have $1 million and billion-dollar bonuses. Merrill Lynch, I think, paid out $3 billion in bonuses while going bankrupt and being absorbed by another company, all at our expense. That shouldn't happen, makes people angry. The president taps into that. What I would say is we as conservatives tap into that, but we say government shouldn't be bailing that out. But if you come by it honestly, if you work hard, if people will buy your product, if you're the Walton family and you come up with a great concept, by all means, make as much money as you can and employ as many people as you can. And let's not be embarrassed by that. But I think this election in some ways will be more philosophic between two concepts. And I think the concepts are the American dream, those who believe that you can have success and that we have mobility and that anyone can achieve in our society, and those who want to just divide up the existing pie and try to redistribute it. I think there's enough people left in America who believe in the American dream. If we make it on that, I think we'll be successful. And I think conservatives, the future of conservatism is promoting a system that creates incredible wealth, but also creates incredible wealth that provides for incredible humanitarian purposes. I think if we do that, conservatism will win. Thank you very much for Mallory for having me, and I'll be happy if you're going to ask a few questions as well.
Thank you.